Since the United States achieved its pinnacle of world power in the late 40s and in the 50s and in the 60s, we've faltered and declined for a variety of reasons. But we are definitely at an inflection point now where it may be very, very difficult for us ever to regain that.
That's the voice of David Rothkopf, political scientist, journalist, and professor of international relations. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. But first, here are your co-hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back to Press the Button. This is our 58th episode and our 10th week of sheltering in place, which for me means recording this from my basement bunker in Tacoma Park, Maryland.
And I am coming from a closet in New Haven, Connecticut. Today's early warning is all about the urgent need to rethink national security, which just happens to be the theme for the newest season of the podcast, Things That Go Boom. Host Laicie Heeley joins John Carl Baker and I to talk about what the real threats are and what makes us safer.
I'm so glad Laicie's back with another season of Things That Go Boom. I love her podcast. I love her take on it. It's like This American Life, except about nuclear weapons. So I hope you'll listen to her. When does it air? When does it first come on, Michelle?
It is out now, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts.
As soon as you finish listening to this one. Okay, good. Because we have a great episode for you. I get to sit down with David Rothkopf. David is the host of Deep State Radio over at the DSRnetwork.com. He has a long and lustrous career in this town. He previously served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade Policy. In the Clinton administration. That's quite a title. But more importantly, for our purposes, he's the former editor of Foreign Policy. He's the author of more than 1,000 articles on international affairs and at least a half dozen books. Most prominently, and at least the one I read, was his Running the World, the inside story of the National Security Council and the architects of American power. He has a new book coming out this fall called, oh boy, this is a heck of a title, Traitor, A History of American Betrayal from Benedict Arnold to Donald Trump. Wow. What a title. Usually David asks me the questions when I'm on his podcast, but this time we got to interview him, and he provides us with a comprehensive and disturbing assessment of the decline of American power and the three crises we confront today: the devastating pandemic, the collapse of our economy, and the incompetence and corruption of our government. You combine these three crises and you create a situation that's unlike any the United States has faced since we emerged as a world power in the early part of the 20th century. It is an intense discussion with one of the master analysts in the country. I hope you'll listen.
And then we lighten things up with my favorite segment, where I asked you a question from one of our listeners. Today we have a question from someone who is international, and so I hope you are ready, Joe.
I am. I enjoy these questions, and thank you to our listeners for sending them in. As a reminder, I'll be officially retiring soon, so send your questions in before I leave on July 1st.
Now's your chance to ask Joe any question you want. So send us your questions through a tweet or a direct message. We're at PressButtonPod. And while you're there, give us a follow. And if you're not on Twitter, you can send us an email at pressthebutton@ploughshares.org and give the show a rating on Spotify, Apple Music, or anywhere you get your podcasts.
And we have one more exciting announcement for you. June 8th. Mark your calendars. That's a Monday, 3 weeks away. We have Chain Reaction. This is Ploughshares Fund annual gala. And this year, you're all invited.
That's right. Normally our gala is an in-person event where we get all dressed up. But given the global pandemic, we decided to shift the event to a digital format. That means you, our listeners, will be able to join us with complimentary tickets.
Yeah, and you can come in your pajamas. There is no dressing up. It'll be a Zoom event. And, we don't normally offer free tickets for Chain Reaction, but since so much is different this year, we wanted to give you the chance to join us online for this incredible event. We usually hold it in the San Francisco Jazz Center. We have about 250, 300 people. But this year, because of the pandemic, we get to go national. So we're hoping to get a very large audience to hear speakers like me. I'll be giving my valedictorian address, my last address as president of Ploughshares. But more importantly, we have Governor Jerry Brown. We have former Secretary of Defense William J. Perry. We have a panel from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, some of their top scientists, including an epidemiologist who's going to keep us up to date on what's happening with the pandemic. And we'll be analyzing the threats to our global community, not just nuclear weapons, but climate change and now the pandemics. And I cannot stress this enough. This is normally a ticketed event. We usually charge about $250 per ticket. It's a fundraiser for us. But this year, it's free. We hope you'll come. We'll hope you'll learn. We'll hope you'll enjoy it.
You can find details about it on our website, ploughshares.org, or on any of our social media accounts. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can find all the information you need there.
So thank you for tuning into our podcast. We've got a packed episode for you, and the clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Today I'm joined by John Carl Baker, Senior Program Officer at Ploughshares Fund, and Laicie Heeley, Founder and CEO of Inkstick Media. Laicie is the host of the fantastic podcast, Things That Go Boom, about the ins, outs, and what have yous of what keeps us safe, and which dropped its first episode of its third season. Full disclosure, Ploughshares Fund is a proud supporter of Things That Go Boom, and we are thrilled to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to join. I've been dying to come on and join you guys.
You know the drill, 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear news. Laicie, I'm not going to lie, the beginning of your new episode of Things That Go Boom nearly brought me to tears. It was really challenging to listen to the early stories of the pandemic. I know this season is all about redefining national security, something that's become even more necessary since COVID began. What do you think the U.S. should be prioritizing? What was it like to put together this story in the midst of this global crisis?
Thank you so much. It was hard. I won't lie. We actually entered this season thinking about great power competition and thinking about, whether that was really the direction our country should be headed, if we should be buying more big weapons or we should be thinking about other things. And then smack right in the middle of production, coronavirus hit. And it's this big, stark, obvious example of what we're missing and where we're not investing. And so, that opening, it was really hard for me going through, just like it was hard for all of us, going through this slow tsunami of understanding and realization that we were in the middle of a very real crisis. And that could happen to us again, and we could not be prepared. And so that really is the focus of this season, is what really keeps us safe. And, are we buying the right things to keep us safe?
I was really struck by the moment in the episode where you are asking attendees at a defense conference what the biggest threats are. And they are saying things like climate change, threats to democracy, not hypersonics.
Yeah.
Do you think we're at a turning point in how we think about security here in the U.S.?
I think we could be. And I think we were coming up to that turning point even before coronavirus hit. We've been pumping a lot of money into the Pentagon in recent years, and for many, many years. We spend more than $700 billion a year on defense. And when we talk about the trade-offs, it's, all of these things. We could buy 2,200 ventilators for the price of an F-35. We could, just 1 year of spending on nuclear weapons could buy just an incredible number of ICU beds, ventilators, and masks. We think about all these things that we didn't have stockpiled, that we weren't focused on, even though we did know that very much we knew that the threat of a global pandemic was real. In fact, we talked to somebody in the first episode who was part of a war game that played almost exactly this scenario out. So it was a known threat, and still we were we were buying big weapons. We were preparing for a war with China. And that's not getting us very far now. So I think that something that felt very theoretical yesterday feels very real today. And there's a chance that might change some thinking around this issue.
Speaking of how we spend our money, John Carl, on Friday, the House passed the latest round of COVID relief funding, which now goes to the Senate for consideration, and it is unlikely to pass the Senate as is. While there was a lot of discussion about what it includes, it's also notable for what it doesn't include. No new funding for the Pentagon. What happened?
Well, I would say this is a small victory, but it's a pretty significant one. If you recall, phase 3 of the big COVID relief packages gave the military $10.4 billion more dollars, which brought their overall appropriations in fiscal year 20 to more than $750 billion. So a month ago, more than 60 organizations got together and sent a letter to the majority and minority leadership in the House and Senate, urging them not to include any more money for the Pentagon in future relief bills. And these were some pretty heavy hitters. I mean, it was groups like Win Without War, Move On, Demand Progress, Indivisible, who basically said enough is enough. We don't want any more cash for the Pentagon. And with the HEROES Act, we now have evidence that the Dem leadership in the House actually agrees with them. So it's fairly significant.
So then my question is, for both of you, do you think we're about to enter an era in which defense budgets go down?
It has yet to be seen. We are certainly, there's going to be a squeeze on the economy moving forward. We all know that. There's no question. Things are going to have to be cut. And one of the biggest, most obvious places where Congress might choose to cut is in the Pentagon budget. That said, there are huge constituencies in Congress fighting back against even the tiniest cuts to Pentagon spending. And so it's going to be a big fight, and we'll see how that all comes out in the end.
I would add, too, that it's important to remember that we've been in situations like this before. After the end of the Cold War, there was the famous peace dividend, where all the money that we had been spending trying to keep the Soviets at bay was suddenly going to go to social needs. And guess what? That didn't actually happen. And in fact, even though defense spending went down for a while, then it started creeping back up again, and we know where it's at now. There are historical precedents for this. It's up to us to actually call a halt to this and say enough is enough. We've got to stop.
Our next episode actually talks a little bit about that peace dividend, so folks can tune in.
You can pay me later, Laicie.
It's perfect. That was a great plug.
And Laicie, where can listeners go to find Things That Go Boom?
So folks can find it anywhere that they listen to podcasts. You can also go to Inkstick Media. That's inkstickmedia.com. And it's there, or prx.org.
And on that note, our 7 minutes are up. Thank you, John Carl and Laicie, for joining.
Thank you so much.
I'm Joe Cirincione, and I'm talking with David Rothkopf today. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
I want to talk with you about the end of the world as we know it, as REM would say. You are one of the most knowledgeable, experienced experts on foreign policy and national security that I know, and that I largely agree with. So I want your overall assessment. How bad is it? How tough a spot are we in on American governance, on our ability to exercise a coherent foreign policy, on our geopolitical situation in the world as a result of this coronavirus and our government's response to it?
You know, the situation is certainly very difficult. It's the worst public health crisis the United States has faced in over 100 years, combined with the worst economic crisis the United States has faced since the Great Depression. And it soon may be in the next several weeks that we actually have a higher unemployment rate than we did at the worst of the Great Depression. So the economic crisis may be more difficult even than that. But those aren't the only two crises we face. I think compounding both of them, and to a large degree responsible for both of them, we have a leadership crisis. We have a president who's in denial about the origins of pandemic, who's in denial about what needs to be done to help the country economically, who seeks scapegoats around the world, including in countries like China, with whom we already have difficult relationship, but who are essential to geopolitical balance in the future, and who's frankly unfit for the job, who's intellectually unfit for the job, who's emotionally unfit for the job, who rejects advice, and who, despite all evidence to the contrary, believes that he's his own best expert. So you combine those three things, you've got a situation unlike any the United States has faced since we emerged as a world power in the early part of the 20th century.
And that's what I want to explore with you next. I've been thinking about this a lot, about where this puts us in this rise to global dominance that began in World War II and then just took off. Have we flattened the curve? Has American power now peaked, and are we in fact going down, in part because of what's happening in the rest of the world, but in large part because of what we're doing to ourselves?
Well, I think there are a lot of metrics we can use. I think if you look at U.S. Economic power, at the end of World War II, half of all global trade went through the United States. That's fallen precipitously over the years, and we don't have that kind of clout anymore. Our leadership position has been eroding, frankly, since the end of the Cold War, primarily because absent an enemy, the raison d'etre for a lot of the alliances faded. And frankly, both Republican and Democratic presidents have been unclear about what the successor role for the United States should be. Now, having said that, having an unclear president who's up to the job and still believes that the U.S. should lead and believes in science and history and math is a lot better than having a U.S. president who doesn't believe in any of those things, doesn't understand where we are, has no concept of history, and is actually allied both spiritually and practically with our worst enemies, including Russia, and with ideas and ideologies that are completely contrary to what has helped make America great, including kind of authoritarian, anti-democratic impulse, a desire to embrace dictators, a complete absence of any sort of conscience or desire to place issues like human rights or democracy at the center of what we do. And then he combines that with some of the worst traits that you would want to see in a leader with the ability to disrupt the world. As you often point out, he has unparalleled capability to launch nuclear disaster upon the world. He's kind of militaristic. He likes to saber rattle. He has brought the world to the brink of war a couple of times already. And once cornered and without any real good options, we all have to wonder what his choices will be. What his choices will be with regard to American democracy, what his choices will be with regard to geopolitical situations from Iran to Israel and Palestine to China to North Korea that will, he thinks may make him look better, but actually may damage us greatly. So, it's a long way of saying since the United States achieved its pinnacle of world power in the late 40s and in the 50s and in the 60s, we've faltered and declined for a variety of reasons. But we are definitely at an inflection point now where it may be very, very difficult for us ever to regain that, and where we may have been permanently relegated to the kind of great power status as opposed to superpower status that, has been the fate of many other countries that were once in our position. And for anybody who doubts that and says, but we have the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, I would point out that we don't have the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, as you know better than anybody. The Russians do. And nobody thinks the Russians are a superpower.
Given that, what's the kind of foreign policy you think we should be moving towards? What are the kinds of things we should be doing to ensure U.S. security in a world where we're not the dominant power?
Well, first of all, I think we have a job of work to do at home. Even George Kennan in the famous, X-telegram, where he talks about the threat posed by the Russians in about 1947, ends the telegram by saying the secret to our strength is who we are at home, how we lead by example. We have to have functioning democracy. We have to have functioning markets. We can't leave huge portions of our population behind. And, this COVID crisis has revealed that if you don't provide healthcare to people, and if you don't provide unemployment benefits, and if you take care of the rich and you don't take care of the poor, the greatest country in the world turns out to be a very fragile giant. And can be brought to its knees rather easily. So job number one, we have to get strong at home. Internationally, I think we need to adapt, but not blindly embrace the principles that we proposed at the end of World War II, which is to say we need an international system, we need international institutions. Each country must cede some of its authority to those institutions. We need to find ways by which the rule of law can guide us in the resolution of disputes between countries. Internationally, we need to build alliances, find common interests, and use those common interests to help advance our own national interests. Donald Trump has lost sight of reason for treaties. Treaties are not a deal where we're sort of selling protection, for example, to Europe. We're gaining protection from Europe. They have put themselves on the front line of, for example, the Cold War for decades and decades. We benefited from that. We need to see that again. But I think the difference is that whereas the post-World War II global system that we were the primary architect of focused on kind of a transatlantic alliance at the center of it and a handful of powers as being the central powers, we have to recognize that emerging powers of the world are left out of a lot of that discussion. And that's completely inappropriate. And the new international order needs to include at the table China and India and Brazil, countries like Japan that are left out of some of those institutions, or Germany that are left out of some of those institutions, and we need to have a voice for the rest of the world. So the post-World War II architecture was very much U.S. World War II ally-centric. We need to look at the 21st century and create something that is sort of, if to take from the Dean Acheson autobiography title, President at the Creation, we need President at the Creation 2.0. We need a new vision for a global system that can work to our advantage and in which we can then resume a leadership role.
And we're not doing any of that now. And I want to take a quick look at one specific area which you wrote about recently, and that's the Middle East. I used to say that Rex Tillerson was the worst Secretary of State in U.S. history, and then we got Mike Pompeo. And it makes me wish for Rex Tillerson. You called him in your recent article in the Israeli daily newspaper Haaretz a threat to the Middle East. You called the Secretary of State a threat to the Middle East, talking about what he and Trump and an equally desperate Israeli leader might do in just the months ahead. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're concerned about?
Sure. I mean, the pretext for the visit of Pompeo was, to discuss COVID or discuss Iran. But the reality of it was that Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, seeks to unilaterally annex Palestinian territory because that plays to his base in the Israeli far right. It also plays to the base of the American far right, Christian evangelicals who, believe the U.S. should draw close to Israel, although, I might point out not for reasons that are particularly good for Israelis. The things don't turn out so well in the end of the rapture for the Jews.
But I have relatives in Israel, and I'm wondering, do they know what the plan is for these evangelicals? How this game ends for the Jews?
No, it's very, very dark, and of course we're in a bizarre situation, one that I never thought that I would see. I've been worried about the rise of evangelicals in American politics since Pat Robertson a long, long time ago. But you have in Pompeo an evangelical who has publicly stood there and said, we will pursue these policies until the rapture. He has brings up biblical references throughout what he has done, and in fact represents a kind of a theocratic view in the hard right of the Republican Party that's very disturbing. But what's more disturbing to me, quite apart from that in the near term, is Trump is in trouble and will seek to do anything that can distract from his troubles and might help him politically. And this could include giving carte blanche to Bibi Netanyahu to go and seize more Palestinian land unilaterally. As recently as today, the U.S. has said, these desire to annex these properties should take place in the context of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations under the terms of the Trump peace plan. The Trump peace plan is a complete sham, so as a plan that was designed by Jared Kushner, David Friedman, and some other sort of hard right types to support the agenda of not of Israel, of the Israeli hard right. And so this could lead to conflict. But if I could, in just 20 seconds, I would also like to say that as erratic as Trump is, and he's erratic, and as difficult as it is to talk about Trump foreign policy, because he doesn't understand history, there is no coherence here, he doesn't take advice, he's very impulsive, there is one consistent thread throughout Trump foreign policy, and that is to reject the basic tenets on which all of U.S. foreign policy have been based since 1945, which is to say, build alliances, build an international system, build international institutions, use those international institutions as a way to leverage U.S. power, make democracy, make human rights centerpieces of the objective of those institutions. Trump, at every single turn since the moment he has taken office, has attacked those things, whether it's pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, or pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or pulling out of arms agreements, or pulling out of alliances, or attacking allies, or not paying UN institutions, or fighting the UN, or not paying the WHO, and so every single time he's had a chance to weaken the international order that the U.S. spent 75 years building, he has done it, and that is extremely dangerous. And you have to ask yourself, why has he done that? And there are very few people in the world for whom that strategy works. It is primarily of value to those who are not benefiting from that system. And number one on that list is Russia, the country that helped elect Trump and to whom Trump has been beholden ever since.
One of the things I love about Deep State Radio and the series of podcasts that you do is how you integrate and combine the foreign policy, national security issues with the domestic political issues, and they play against each other. They're part of the same dynamic, and you can't look at one without examining the other. So let me look with you at the politics of the GOP. We'll get to the Democrats. We're an equal opportunity podcast. We criticize both parties on this show. But let me start with the GOP. You called them in a tweet a few days ago. The GOP is the party of superstition, lies, and conspiracy theories, which is precisely why it is so popular. How do you think the GOP is judging this moment? What do you think they're doing? How are they going to game out this current election?
Well, I don't know. I think they must be going through a period of real cognitive dissonance and confusion right now. Because on the one hand, Donald Trump has the highest approval rating that he has had in a couple of years, despite approaching 90,000 dead in this crisis, despite 36.5 million people being put out of work in the past 8 weeks, despite all the other things that you can cite, including the fact, and I know this seems a decade or two ago, that he was impeached a few months ago. And so they look, and there's, I think, a view within the Republican Party. He is a political mastermind, and he has tapped into the base, and clearly the base is extremely loyal to him because he can do all these awful things, and they continue to support him. On the other hand, Joe Biden has steadily led in all of the polls for months and months now. Joe Biden leads in a number of key swing states. And it looks right now, if the election were held today based on these polls, like Joe Biden would win. And there is the possibility, given that the economic crisis will deepen, the healthcare crisis will deepen, that Republicans may be swept out of office in an unprecedented fashion, in a wave election. They need, they must be afraid of this. Because first of all, they have adopted a scorched earth policy. Mitch McConnell is an extremely dangerous character who has just, said, I'll take what I can get, however I can get it, regardless of the consequences. And they must worry what the Democrats will do following that, or how they will, prosecute open cases following that. So, on the one hand, they think they've got this ace in the hole with Trump, who's amazing genius, and, maybe he'll eke this out. And on the other hand, they face the potential end of their party as a viable force in American politics. And I don't know how that works out, but I do know that the behind the scenes conversations that you have with Republicans are nothing like the front of the camera conversations they have.
What do you mean?
They're afraid.
Yeah. So what do you think Biden's election strategy is?
2 months ago, Biden's strategy was, let's go back to the good old days. That was not a particularly popular strategy with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but it got Biden to where he was. Having said that, there's been an economic cataclysm as well as a public health cataclysm, and you can't go back to the good old days. And I think Biden's strategy has got to be, do you want me to rebuild the country, or do you want Donald Trump and the Republicans to rebuild the country? Do you want the 1% to rebuild the country and make inequality work for them as they have been doing for the past 40 years? Or do you want us to rework the country for Main Street and for the average American? Do you want us to create jobs? Do you want us to fix healthcare? Do you want us to fix the social safety net? And I think, he's going to have to emphasize those things. And, I have to give him credit. I didn't expect this, but he has handled Bernie Sanders extremely well. He's handled potential for fragmentation within the party fairly well. He's created these committees with the Sanders team in order to try to bring together progressive and centrist views. I think, by the way, this is practical because I think the electorate has moved in a direction that might be called more progressive over time. And if you take healthcare or gun control or the environment or retirement issues, the views of the majority of the American people are actually progressive views. So it'll be interesting to see. The other thing Biden has done that I think is smart is he's essentially said, look, I'm a transitional candidate. I'm going to put together the best and the brightest of the future of the Democratic Party. We're going to bring them together, and I'm going to set us up to lead for a long time. I think that's the right move for a guy who's his age.
Yeah. New York Magazine recently published a piece claiming, based on their interviews, that Biden was thinking about an FDR-sized presidency, that he was going to have to come in big and make sweeping changes, dramatic reforms to core institutional structures in this country, including things like healthcare and guaranteed income. Do you buy that? What do you think?
Inshallah. I certainly hope that's what he does. There's elements to it. One is the vision, and it's not just Republicans, although it's primarily Republicans who have put us in this pickle. But for 40 years, inequality has been growing in the United States. It is a scandal that the minimum wage in the United States on a adjusted basis is lower today than it was in the 1970s. It's a scandal that 90% of the benefits of the growth that followed the 2008-2009 financial crisis accrued to the top 10% of the population, most to the top 1%, the bulk of it to the top 0.1%. It is a scandal that if 40 million people in the United States lose their jobs, that they're also going to be losing their health care because we're the only country in the world that doesn't provide that as a right. It is a scandal that in a country where 40% of the American people have less than $400, this kind of a crisis wipes them out in an instant, where 65 and up Americans, the average amount they have in savings is $65,000. So this fundamental component of the social contract, which is to ensure dignity and retirement, has been broken. Most people, and Joe, you and I are of a certain age, most people who are of our age are afraid, and they will never know retirement. They will work until they are dead because that part of the social contract has been broken. Most people who are lucky enough to go to college in the United States end up with a financial burden from college that continues with them until they reach the end of their careers. So, healthcare is broken, unemployment benefits are broken, retirement benefits are broken. The system is unequal and serves a very small fraction of the population. And we now know that if you have a crisis like this, and those are the conditions, the nation falls to its knees. We lack the resilience that any great power requires, but we also lack the humanity and the decency and the sense of the importance of human dignity that any great power requires. And frankly, unless we fix those things, to go back to your very first question, we will not be the great power of the next century as we have been in the past century, and we will not deserve to be the great power.
And as Joe Biden, let's say he is elected, tries to fix those, what do you think about his foreign policy, his national security policy? What do you think specifically about the advisors he's clustered around him?
Well, a lot of these people are people that I've known and that I respect a lot. And, his foreign policy team led by, people like Tony Blinken. You would expect to see somebody like Bill Burns, who runs Carnegie Endowment now, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, playing a big role in that. The people I know who are advising him on defense policy and so forth are smart, capable people, many of them, mutual friends of ours. And so, I think he's got a good team, and I think it's a team that is likely to try to restore a lot of the good values in American politics. But I want to say something cautionary, and I want to say something unpopular. Going back to the foreign policy of Barack Obama is not the direction we need to head. Barack Obama was involved in essentially a retreat of American leadership around the world. He was far too cautious. He made deep mistakes, not just in Syria, but in not standing up sufficiently to the Russians, in not leading in the way that we should have led on the climate talks. We came in at the end of it, and frankly, the Paris Accord is a weak accord. Not achieving his goal, as you know, I'm sure you were acutely aware of. When he spoke in Prague, for example, and said we're going to eliminate nuclear weapons, he didn't get anywhere nearly close to that. Didn't get anywhere nearly close to having a strategic vision for the world. So, would it be better to have Obama than Trump? No question. Obama was a decent human being. He was doing his best. But as we look forward to the challenges we face as a country, and we have to rebuild the international system, we need a vision for that. We need people who are creative. And frankly, I think we need new blood. The more people we see who take some of these top jobs, who then just go back to their old playbook, the more I'm going to worry about American leadership in the long run.
Outstanding. Thank you, David. Thank you. That was as clear and as comprehensive and as integrated a view as I could have hoped for. Real, very insightful talking to you. Where can people go to get more of your analysis?
Well, first of all, I'm sure if I had been asking you the questions, we would have had an even better view. And I hope people will go to Deep State Radio, and we'll have you on regularly again, as we have in the past, because you're so good. But, you can find and follow Deep State Radio wherever you get your podcasts. There's the DSR network that distributes our podcasts and some of the other content that we're creating. We're creating a series of webinars coming up. I have a book coming out in the fall called Traitor, A History of American Betrayal, from Benedict Arnold to Donald Trump, which is coming out from St. Martin's Press. And I encourage people to, get that. And of course, I write for a bunch of places regularly, including the Daily Beast and Haaretz and USA Today, or do TV hits, so forth. But, come to Deep State Radio, and you too, Joe. Come on back and let's continue the discussion.
I always enjoy going on, and it is required listening for me. I never fail to listen to and benefit from your episodes. Thank you very much, David. It's been a real pleasure. You are a very busy man. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Same to you. I appreciate the invitation and admire all the incredibly good and important work you do.
We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now the segment where I get to ask Joe a question he's never seen before. Joe, are you ready for this?
I'm in my glass enclosed booth. I have my blindfolds on. I'm ready to go.
Today's question comes from Zhao, who is located in Europe. And his question is about the recent announcement of Germany's Junior Coalition Party, SPD, that U.S. nuclear weapons have no place in Germany, which comes at a time when Germany is about to phase out its Tornado fighters. Do you think this should be taken as a serious prospect for U.S.-German relations and ultimately for NATO's credibility? German politicians seem to be assuming that if Trump leaves the White House next year, everything will be, quote, back to normal. But there's a strong historical mistrust of the U.S. among the German left. I would like to know your views on this.
Wow. Great question, and quite attuned to the developments that are going on. Look, ever since the U.S. invented nuclear weapons, they've been offered to our allies as part of our security guarantees, in part to strengthen our alliances. There's a global alliance system unlike anything any country has ever had in the world. We have the strongest, most diverse alliance system of any country ever. But also as a nonproliferation tool, also to help convince countries like Germany, which was considering a nuclear program in the early 1960s, not to develop a nuclear program. It wasn't sufficient to stop France and Great Britain from developing nuclear weapons, but the rest of Europe has not. So this policy has more or less succeeded. The question is, do you still need this policy? Do you still need nuclear assurances to Europe? Do you still need U.S. nuclear weapons stationed in Europe. We used to have thousands of nuclear weapons stationed there of all kinds, short-range rockets, long-range rockets, ship-based, landmines, bazookas, all kinds of nuclear weapons. We pulled them out, and a lot of it was pulled out under the W. Bush administration, by the way, Donald Rumsfeld. No consultations, no public announcements. He just yanked them out. We're down to about 150 left in 5 storage areas, most prominently and most dangerously about 50 hydrogen bombs stashed in Turkey. But we have about a dozen or so, maybe 20 or so, nuclear weapons still stored in Germany. And as part of their participation in this nuclear partnership, Germany has maintained a fleet of fighter jets capable of dropping nuclear weapons. And that fleet is now aging out. And the question is, will they buy new ones? And part of the governing coalition of Germany is objecting to this. They want the U.S. nuclear weapons out of Germany. They don't want to buy these new fighters. They don't want the expense, but more importantly, they don't want the weapons themselves. In some ways, this is like the reverse of the 1960s, where we were promising nuclear weapons would be part of our security assurances in order to keep Germany from going nuclear. Now, the Trump administration is making threats about pulling out of the NATO alliance if Germany does not continue this nuclear partnership. So this is a real crisis. This is really going on. I actually hope the German government decides to end this nuclear relationship. We do not need to be storing tactical nuclear weapons, air-dropped bombs in Germany or in Belgium or in Italy or in Turkey or in the Netherlands, which is where they all are. We don't need these. They're obsolete weapons. They don't serve any useful military purpose or strategic purpose. We should be weaning NATO away from reliance on nuclear threats, not tying them to this outdated Cold War strategy. So thank you. Thank you for the question. This is an ongoing argument in the NATO alliance. It's unclear how it's going to end. If there is a resolution, you'll hear it first here on Press the Button.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for our listeners for sending these questions in. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.